Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time is an action platformer released in 2003 by Ubisoft. You know, back when people actually liked them. It was intended as a hard reboot of the classic Prince of Persia series after the complete disaster that was 1999's Prince of Persia 3D. For myself and a lot of others, I'm sure, it was the first taste we got of this storied video game franchise. The game went on to be a smash hit, spawning 3 direct sequels as well as another reboot in 2008, and an aggressively mediocre film starring Jake Gyllenhaal. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. A remake of the game was announced last year for release in January, but was pushed back to March and then pushed back indefinitely. So with that being said, I figured now would be the perfect time to do a review of the original game. And let me be completely transparent here, I love this game. Some of my fondest memories from high school are staying up late on weekends playing Prince of Persia. I don't want you to think that just because I have some great memories of it though, that makes me blind to its faults or where it has aged poorly. But I feel it's only right to tell you where my inherent biases lay. So there you have it. Let's go ahead and get into my thoughts on it. When this game came out originally, I thought it was one of the prettiest games I'd ever seen. And for the most part, I think it's aged gracefully. For starters, if you want to play it on PC, there are some barriers you're going to have to clear. The resolution caps out at 1600 by 1200, and you may get the dreaded fog bug that makes it look like you walked into a really crowded vape shop. These are easy fixes, and a YouTuber by the name of Nick930 has put together a very easy to understand guide on circumventing these problems. The link for that will be available in the description. So once you get the game running and looking good, how is it? Well, like I just said, when it was released, this game was among the most visually pleasing I'd ever seen, and I wasn't alone in that. The warm Disney-like glow to the whole setting really gives you the feeling you're watching a classic animated adventure. And while obviously age has taken its toll, I still think that assessment holds up. The character models for the Prince and Farah in particular still look damn good, and the enemy models are still respectable, especially for a game from 2003. The cloth, dirt, and water physics were super impressive for the time, and still look pretty decent. The way dirt gets kicked up from the walls when you're running across them, the way water splashes when you fall into it. Sure, all this stuff seems run-of-the-mill now, but this was one of the first games to be so detailed in its presentation. That's not even including the mind-blowing fluidity to the Prince's movement. At the time of its release, the Prince was probably the most nimble and acrobatic character in all of gaming. The wall-running animation alone made me smile damn near every time I did it, and still does if I'm being honest. As revolutionary as Devil May Cry was for the sheer variety of Dante's moveset and combat, Sands of Time was that, but for movement in general. This was way before the expectation for an action game protagonist was they moonlighted as a gymnast. The sheer athleticism and grace the Prince possesses is still enjoyable to this day, and the game's influence can definitely still be felt in pretty much every action platformer that came after it. The sound design for this game is still top-notch too, be it crumbling rubble, the sharp ping your sword makes when an enemy blocks it, and of course all the awesome supernatural stuff that happens when you use the dagger abilities. The voice acting is also really solid. This was long before games were trying as hard as they could to be Oscar-winning films, and most of the cast was just having fun with it. This is fun in a good way though. The actors for Farah and the Prince nail the hilarious back and forth banter between them, and make it really clear to the audience they are hornier for each other than Twitter is over Lady Dimitrescu. The Vizier does his best Disney villain impersonation, and is clearly enjoying the role, but not so much it doesn't feel like he's taking it seriously. The one thing I will say is for being a game set in the Middle East, everyone sounds very British, including the Persian prince and Farah, who is Indian. The worst offender being the random guard you encounter who has the thickest Cockney accent imaginable. There would definitely be some hot takes from Twitter about whitewashing and cultural appropriation if this game came out now, but 2003 was a simpler time. The music is fantastic and still one of my favorite game soundtracks ever. The Middle Eastern-inspired tunes bounce flawlessly between enchanting melodies during exploration and pulse-pounding guitar riffs during combat. I find it so much more likable than the sequel, which thought blaring the same Godsmack song every 10 minutes was a good idea, but that's a review for another day. As far as what hasn't aged well, first we have some of the level aesthetics. There are definitely some parts where it's great, and that's mostly in the areas that roll with the game's bright and warm tone, but there's some where it's very muddy and bland. These are usually parts that were intended to be dark and kind of dreary, so I get what they were going for, and it worked back then. It's not a huge knock because they were obviously more concerned with the interactive parts of the level than some wall you'd walk past in a cave. This kind of stuff is also pretty much par for the course when you're talking about this era of games. Secondly, the camera. Now, it's important to remember this game was a pioneer in a lot of ways. This was, to the best of my knowledge, one of the first 3D action games to really lean heavy on the parkour-style gymnastics, and a lot of what they did still holds up. The camera, however, is not one of those things. In combat, it has a terrible habit of getting stuck behind objects, blocking your whole view, or being too close so you can't see things coming in off screen. During platforming parts, it's not quite as bad, but still has a tendency to get stuck in odd positions or just break entirely. Thankfully, during these sequences, you don't have to worry about half a dozen enemies swarming you, so you can take advantage of the first-person view or the landscape view to get your bearings. Considering they were trying a lot of new things with the presentation, I'll give them a pass on this. Lastly, there are definitely issues with the sound mixing. As I said, the sound design itself is great, as is the voice acting, but the volume levels are completely erratic. Sometimes you'll have things like a teleporting enemy blowing your eardrums off from across the map, and other times you'll have Farah standing right next to you and you can barely hear what she's saying. They somehow managed to make these problems even worse with the HD collection, so avoid that and just play it on PC if you can. Overall though, I think the presentation is fantastic and still holds up quite well. This game's influence on the action platformer genre really can't be overstated, and a lot of what we take for granted in modern games of the same type descended directly from Sands of Time. It has its flaws, but I truly think those can be looked past when you consider all the things this game pioneered. Now, let's talk about the story.
Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong. Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I am and why I say this. Sit down, and I will tell you a tale like none that you have ever heard.
The game begins with the prince accompanying his father and their army on a journey to visit a sultan who resides within the Persian borderlands. Naturally, the prince's father wants to bring the sultan a gift, and since this is 9th century AD and he has an army, what better way to get a gift than to lay siege to a local noble's land? This is all made easier due to the fact that the noble's clearly trustworthy vizier has betrayed him and is willing to essentially roll out the red carpet for the prince, his father, and their army at the small price of one artifact of his choosing from the noble's vaults. The prince, who is kind of a sniveling brat at this point, is all too eager to prove to his father he's all grown up now and ventures off on his own when the siege begins to find a treasure for himself as well. One he hopes will bring him the fame and glory he desperately desires, since being a spoiled rich kid isn't enough. He makes his way into an underground vault and finds an artifact called the Dagger of Time. He quickly finds out this is a fitting name too, as the dagger seems to have the power to manipulate time itself. He rushes back to proudly show the artifact to his father, And it just so happens this is the artifact the Vizier wants, as he is clearly dying of what appears to be tuberculosis and thinks it can make him immortal. Since the prince is his son and the Vizier is some guy he just met, the king sides with the prince and lets him keep it. They then plunder the rest of the artifacts and women they can get their hands on to present as gifts to the Sultan, chief among them a giant mystical hourglass and the noble's daughter, Farah. Upon arriving at the Sultan's palace and presenting him with their treasure, the Vizier tricks the prince into stabbing this giant hourglass with a dagger and unleashing the Sands of Time, a mysterious supernatural sandstorm that sweeps across the palace and turns everyone but the prince, Farah, the Vizier, and one random guard for some reason into undead sand zombies. The Vizier tries to take the dagger from the prince, promising he can fix the problem he tricked the prince into causing, but our hero understandably doesn't trust him, so he runs away. He eventually meets up with Farah and finds out the only way to fix the mistake he just made is to make his way back to the hourglass and stab it again with the dagger, and the duo heads off to do just that. Now sure, on a surface level the story is pretty generic. It's your classic fantasy adventure that we've seen time after time. Two heroes brought together by circumstance. The prince, though well-meaning, is spoiled and headstrong. Farah is icy, distant, and distrustful. Although, to be fair, her father was murdered and she was kidnapped to be a slave in a harem, so that's pretty understandable. But it's a fairy tale, so best not to get caught up in the unpleasant details. By the end of the story, the prince has matured into a courageous hero who realizes all the glory in the world doesn't matter without having someone to care for. And Farah realizes that for the first time in her life, she's met someone she trusts and who makes her feel safe. However, that's not the whole story, and to fill you in on everything, I'm going to have to get into spoiler territory, so skip ahead to here if you aren't okay with that. Alright, so our duo of heroes fight their way to the hourglass that's holding the Sands of Time, only for the prince to weirdly flake out at the last second, which results in both of them being trapped down in the tombs. Thinking they're going to die, they both confess their love for one another, which has become really obvious by this point in the game. Farah tells the prince a word her mother told her to say when she's in danger, which is a word so silly it can barely be believed.
Kakolukiam.
And oddly enough, this sets the two of them free. They become temporarily separated, and after a string of puzzles, they are reunited just in time to get it on in a hot bath. The prince wakes up from his sex coma to find Farah gone, with the dagger presumably having gone off to reseal the Sands of Time herself. After some fights and platforming, the prince is reunited with her just in time to watch her fall to her death. The Vizier shows up and promises him eternal life if he hands over the dagger, but having just lost the woman he loved, the prince flips over him and stabs the hourglass with the dagger, restoring the Sands of Time. We are then teleported all the way back to before his father invaded Farah's lands, and this is where an interesting revelation happens. You see, throughout the course of the game, the prince is narrating everything as though he's telling someone a story. Every time you die, he makes some remark along the lines of, "Oh no, that's not how it happened."
That's not how it happened.
It's here you find out the person he's been telling the story to is Farah. Realizing the Vizier is going to betray her and her father, the prince rushes to her room with the dagger still in hand and warns her. The Vizier bursts into the room after giving the prince the whole night to tell Farah his story, which was pretty nice of him, and now plans to kill both the prince and Farah, then just make it look like the prince did it. What follows is a pretty lame boss fight in all honesty. The Vizier just summons clones of himself, and after you beat like 3 or 4 of them, you get a cutscene that is hilariously anticlimactic.
And so it ends. How will the Maharaja feel when he finds his only daughter slain by the son of his enemy? Do you have any last words you wish me to communicate to the princess before I kill her. Words of love, perhaps?
Yeah, that's it. He gives his big villain speech and then you just backhand him once and he dies. Jafar he is not. After that, the prince speaks to Farah, who doesn't believe his story, but thanks him for the rescue anyway. He sneaks a kiss, which gets flatly rejected because as far as this version of her is concerned, she just met the guy. And then he uses the dagger one last time to rewind her rejection before returning the dagger to her. As he leaves, Farah asks who he is, and the prince tells her,
Just call me Kakolukia.
And that's the end. Overall, the story is decent. This was from a time where video game narratives were held to a much lower standard outside of RPGs and adventure games. It isn't mind-blowing, but it's serviceable and to the point. Time travel stuff can get out of hand quickly, and I'm glad they didn't go too overboard here. They would expand on the lore and how the Sands of Time work more in the sequels, but I don't want to get into any of that right now. So for this review, we'll give it a verdict as decent. Let's move on to the gameplay. The gameplay in Sands of Time can be broken down into 3 parts: puzzle solving, platforming, and combat. So let's go down the list. Puzzles are pretty straightforward and relatively easy to solve. The only exception to this rule probably being the Hall of Mirrors, which doesn't come until later in the game. Every time you reach a save spot, the prince will see a vision that usually shows the answer to the more challenging parts, and Farah is always there to offer up some suggestions as well. It's actually kind of surprising in retrospect how much the game holds your hand in this regard. When I was 15, it seemed a lot more challenging. Then again, at that age, I was more worried about doing sick wall runs and staring at Farah's torso, so it's not really surprising I missed it. Reviews at the time even pointed out how much more forgiving the puzzles were in this than the original game, and I can believe it. I never got to play the original Apple game or the HD remake of it, but puzzles in the 1980s did not fuck around. Nowadays, a game will make your kid into the biggest Chad possible as long as you're willing to fork over the credit card. Back then, game developers wanted to send your kid to bed crying and reflecting on what a failure they were. The early 2000s was just when the turning point began, but primarily I just think puzzles weren't really the main focus of this game. Platforming, however, was. As I said in the presentation section, the prince was easily the most agile video game protagonist to grace a screen at that point, and they really wanted to show off what he could do. When you add on the fact that the dagger and its rewind time ability were essentially get out of jail free cards anytime you messed up, the developers really could have thrown the kitchen sink at you if they wanted. The focus of the game was to strike a good balance between challenging platforming and showing off the prince's sick moves though, so they definitely held back some. Most of these sections boil down to some combination of wall running to switches, hopping to platforms or levers, and dodging Wile E. Coyote traps. A lot of these also involve teamwork with Farah, as she's skinny enough to squeeze into areas the prince can't fit. There are some that can be a bit challenging, but up until one section right before the end of the game, you have the dagger to fall back on. Not only can you rewind time if you ever make a mistake, but you can also slow down time, giving you more room for error with the segments you really need to be precise on. The section I was talking about without the dagger can be a pain, especially when you factor in the barbarically cruel checkpoint system, But the game also knows it's asking a lot of you in this segment and turns down the difficulty a notch when compared to some earlier sections. Overall, I really enjoyed the platforming parts. It's challenging enough to feel rewarding when you make it through, and really shows off what a badass the prince is as he glides around the levels like a crazy Persian Spider-Man. I suppose they could have turned up the difficulty, but if that's what your main concern is, you should probably be playing something like Cuphead instead. Now let's talk combat. This is probably the most criticized aspect of Sands of Time, and even as someone who loves this game to death, I can concede there's merit to that. Throughout the game, you'll be confronted by various sand demons, and the enemy variety itself is decent enough. You start off fighting normal sand warriors and possessed harem girls, and then as you work your way through the game, you start having to deal with more elite fighters like the sand generals. There's also enemies like the scarabs, birds, and most annoying of all, the bats. These guys only like fighting you when you're in the middle of platforming, and mainly try to kill you via gravity. They're obviously supposed to be obnoxious, and they're perfectly designed for that goal. All of this sounds decent, so what's the problem? Well, in order to actually kill enemies, you need to knock them down and absorb them into the dagger, or freeze them with the dagger and cut them in half. So this kind of boxes you into a corner with what you can do. You're pretty much forced to find the quickest way you can to knock an enemy over, and then absorb them into the dagger. Vaulting over an enemy or off of a wall and hitting them usually scores a knockdown immediately, then you just vacuum them up with the dagger and that's it. Their movesets don't change at all. The only thing higher level enemies bring to the table is they'll knock you down if you try vaulting over them directly, but other than that, they're the same as the low level versions. When you combine this with some really long waves of enemies, things become tiresome kind of quick. It's just vault, stab, absorb, repeat over and over. You can try and drag the battles out if you want, but there really isn't any motivation to. Especially for the fights that Farah accompanies you, as if she dies you have to start over, and she's really good at dying. Other than that, the only thing you really have to worry about is getting knocked down and surrounded, because this can result in you just getting wailed on over and over.
Strike and strike and strike and strike and strike.
This shouldn't happen often though, as the prince is so fast he basically makes the enemy mobs look like they're standing still. Usually when it does, it's because the camera decided to move behind a pillar and block your vision entirely, or things get so clustered you accidentally tried vaulting over the wrong enemy. But remember, the dagger is always there to bail you out. For the section you lose the dagger, you're rewarded with a sword that kills enemies in one hit, so you can pretty much just spam click your way through that entire part. I definitely understand the gripes with the combat. And so did Ubisoft, because it was one of their primary focuses in the sequels. It does get a bit repetitive, and after the initial wow factor of the prince parkouring over everyone wears off, it definitely loses its luster. It starts off fun, and the game isn't very long though, so at least there's that. But I'd be lying if I said it's perfect. Overall, I think the gameplay still holds up pretty well. The platforming is still better than a lot of modern games, and the puzzles are enjoyable despite being kind of rare and on the easy side. The combat does get kind of repetitive and doesn't really have a lot of depth, but given the brief runtime of the game, I find this pretty forgivable. So overall, I say the sum of the parts is still pretty good. Now for the grade.
It's beautiful. Come on.
Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time is a legendary game, and I think it's deserving of all the praise it gets. The presentation was out of this world at the time it was released, and is still quite solid. The story is fun and doesn't try too hard, but I get a modern audience may find it kind of campy. And the gameplay is still really fun, with phenomenal platforming, which goes a long way in covering the faults of the blandish combat system. 9 out of 10. I definitely think you should play this game. It can be beaten in 6 or 7 hours, so they aren't asking a huge investment of you. If you don't like it as much as I do, then at worst you're out a weekend afternoon. It's $10 on GOG, but it goes on sale fairly often, and you can snag the whole trilogy plus the 2008 game for roughly the same price when it does, so keep an eye out. In channel news, I'm sorry it's been so long since my last video. I spent most of the last 2 months playing a small indie title that you may have heard of, and was totally planning on doing a video on it. I was late to the party though, and by the time I was finished with it and wrote the script, it had become the official dead horse of the internet. I may release it at some point, or just wait for future updates. I don't know. The videos should be dropping regularly again, and I definitely plan on revisiting the Prince of Persia series at some point this year. But for our next stop, we'll be visiting a prequel to an old friend from last year. So stay tuned. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you guys and gals next time.